James Ross was sitting at his desk, drinking his first cup of morning coffee. He was staring out his window instead of going through his inbox for the first time like he would normally have done. Normally, by this time of morning, he would have finished his perusal of the overnight deliveries and made some phone calls to subordinates, but his heart just was not in it any longer. He knew he was letting his boss down, and he knew he should. He had to get his shit together, but he just could not seem to do so. He had already been to 3 weeks of grief counseling, but nothing had improved. He still had trouble sleeping at night, and he spent too much time during the workday feeling sorry for himself. Jim had just sighed and pushed himself away from his desk to make his normal morning trip through the office complex when he heard a gruff voice speak. "As you were." He quickly straightened to attention and turned to the voice. He made an attempt to smile and said, "Good morning, General." Major General Stanley Foster smiled and returned the greeting. "Good morning, Sergeant Major." He looked into the eyes of his division's Sergeant Major and continued, "How are you holding up, Jim?" SGM Ross felt his heart lurch and his chest tighten. He took a moment to get himself under control before he replied, "I guess as well as can be expected, General. I still miss her so damn much." His throat constricted and his eyes watered once more to the point he couldn't speak. He turned from the general so he wouldn't see his eyes and bit his lip. He continued in a broken voice, "Sometimes I don't know how I can make it through the day. I want to tell her something, and then I realize I will never be able to do that ever again. Sometimes I'm not sure it's even worth going on." The general walked up and put his hand on Jim's shoulder and said, "I know how you must hurt, Sergeant Major, but we all have to go on. You have your children still, and you know we all are here for you too if you need help or just need to talk." The general stood with his friend and remembered years past. Then Sergeant Ross had been one of his squad leaders when he got his first platoon after being commissioned in the Army. Over the intervening years, they had been stationed on the same post, many times in the same unit as their careers progressed. Platoon Sergeant Ross had been one of the platoon sergeants when he had command of an infantry company. A few years later, Ross had been a first sergeant in the battalion, then Lieutenant Colonel Foster commanded. As the years progressed, their children grew up together, and their wives became as near friends as it was possible for an enlisted and officer's wife to become. Neither of the families closely followed the customs of the Army religiously, so they had more social interaction than would have normally been common. The men and their wives were kindred spirits, and they liked each other's company enough that they ignored the difference in rank as much as possible. When General Foster was given command of the division, he specially requested Sergeant Major Ross be appointed his division command sergeant major. By then the children had grown and left home, but the men and their wives were happy working and socializing together as much as possible. Of course, they followed convention and socialized with their peers more, but they still made time for their friends. The general and his wife were nearly as devastated as were the Ross children and Jim Ross when a drunken soldier ran a stop sign and T-boned Della Ross's car on post. The autopsy showed she died of a broken neck instantly upon impact. Like happens many times, the soldier, the guilty party in this case, was slightly injured, and Sergeant Major Ross's wife, the innocent party, paid the ultimate price for his stupidity. Of course, the soldier was court-martialed and sentenced to Leavenworth Federal Prison. That did not bring back Della Ross to her loved ones, but hopefully the soldier would not kill anyone else. It had not been the soldier's first arrest for alcohol abuse. He had lost stripes for it before, and there had been a bar on re-enlistment for him because of it. Unfortunately for Della Ross, the Army had not managed to get rid of him in time to save her life. Ever since the accident, now almost 3 months in the past, SGM Ross had been in a funk. He and his fellow soldiers knew he wasn't performing up to his normal standards. In fact, if the truth was told, he was just managing to marginally perform his duties, and he knew he had to do something to get himself together. He felt badly because he was letting his general and his unit down. He just could not seem to get over his loss. General Foster let his hand slide off the SGM's shoulder and turned to his aide. He said, "Well, come on into my office, Captain, and let's get started." The captain followed, opening his day planner as he did so. SGM Ross stood a moment longer looking out the window and getting himself under better control, then turned to make his interrupted tour through the division. He made it his practice to stroll throughout most of the division area at least once a day to supervise the senior sergeants and keep his finger on the pulse of the unit. From time to time, he would stop and visit with a young soldier so he could assess morale, training, and the needs of his men. This day was no different. Just before lunch, he received a phone call from one of his past commanders, Colonel Paul Fielding, retired. "SGM, we have been gone, and I just heard about Della late last week. Jennifer and I are so sorry for your loss. She was a fine lady." The two friends visited for several minutes longer, then as he was ending the call, Paul said, "Jim, I've been talking to Stan, and he told me you were still having a tough time." I've talked to Dad and we reserved a cabin for you for the next 2 weeks. Stan says you need to relax and get your head screwed on better and Jennifer, and I want you to come down so we can see you. SGM Ross began telling Caulfielding he could not go to the resort. He heard a voice and turned from the window he had been looking out of while he talked. General Foster broke into the conversation and said, "Sergeant Major, I have been talking to your counselor and to Paul. We are all in agreement you need to get away and wrap your head around this tragedy. I need you at 100%, and right now you aren't there. You will take the time off. If there is some reason you feel you can't go to the Fielding Resort, that's fine, but you will take some leave." SGM Ross said, "Yes, sir." He then watched the general walk back into his office before he resumed his interrupted conversation with Paul Fielding. "Okay, sir. I guess you heard, or at least know the general has just ordered me to take the time. I'll be there Saturday morning." That evening, Jim packed enough gear to last the 2 weeks he expected to be at the Fielding Resort, drank his supper, and crashed. At his normal rising time of 0530 the next morning, instead of putting on the uniform he had worn for the last 27 years, he got into some cut-off shorts and an old pullover shirt. His head was throbbing and he grimaced, thinking he knew better than to drink like he did when he was in his early 20s. He admitted to himself he had been doing way too much of that since Della died. He filled his thermos with coffee and walked out to his F-250 Super Crew Power Stroke. He fired up the powerful engine, and when it had settled down into a chuckling idle, he drove onto the quiet street on his way to what the Fieldings called their own little slice of paradise in the Ozarks. Late that evening, Jim pulled into Steelville. He stopped at the local cafe for supper, then drove out to the resort. Jim Fielding and his son Paul were waiting on him when he arrived. They introduced him to Paul's sons Jeffrey, now a major in the USAR, and Charlie, also a major in the USAR. After the introductions, they all drove to the cabin assigned to Jim Ross and showed him around. After they got him settled, they broke out the favorite drink of all 5 men, 18-year-old Glenmorangie Quinta Reuben Scotch. Before the evening was over, the entire bottle and most of another was drained. None of the men was completely sober. Jim was assured he would see Jim and Paul's wives the next day at breakfast. Jeff and Charlie's new wives would be there also, and he could meet them for the first time. Once again, the next morning, Jim woke near his usual time. Once again, his mouth felt like a dragon had upchucked in it before it died and rotted. His stomach rolled and his head was throbbing. His mouth was dry, and he was thirstier than he had been at the worst of times in Iraq. In short, he had another hellacious hangover. When Jim arrived at the lodge, he was met by glaring stares from 4 beautiful and tastefully dressed officers' ladies. There were hangdog expressions on the faces of 4 officers, also hungover. He smiled to himself, thinking they were not only in the doghouse for coming home at 3 in the morning roaring drunk, but were suffering a hangover at least as bad as was his. After introductions were made to Abigail and Amanda, Jim got hugs from Ann and Jennifer Fielding. They moved to the outside deck of the resort where coffee was served. After about 30 minutes of coffee on the deck, overlooking the river, waitresses brought out a huge country breakfast. Everyone visited quietly while they consumed the food. When the plates were cleared, the visiting continued for some time. Jim, Ann, and Fielding were the first to leave, then Jeffrey and Abigail. Paul, Jennifer, Charlie, and Amanda visited with Jim a short time longer. Then Charlie offered to show Jim where the best fishing was. Charlie said, "While we're out, I'll give you a short tour of the resort and the surrounding countryside." Charlie was appointed guide allegedly because in his job as a veterinarian he was more familiar with the roads and countryside. Somehow, though, Jim got the impression it was a little more. Before they left, Amanda gave Charlie a gentle kiss. She stared into his eyes while holding him gently around the waist and said, "Honey, I know it still hurts, and you need to talk to him, but be careful. Call me if you need me. I'm going to worry about you. Be sure to let me know where you end up." Charlie looked into her eyes and pulled her to him. They exchanged a sizzling kiss this time, and Jim thought he saw tears in Charlie's eyes when he stepped back. Charlie looked at her for a moment, then he looked at his parents before he said, "We'll just drive around an hour or so, then I think we'll go back to his cabin. I have one of the John boats tied up in the swimming hole for him to use the next 2 weeks. I'll be sure he knows how to run it, then I think we'll spend the rest of the afternoon visiting, unless Jim wants to do something else." Charlie gave Amanda another loving look, then turned to Jim Ross. He said, "Well, Sergeant Major, shall we hit the road, or do you need to do anything beforehand?" "No, sir. I'm good to go." Charlie looked at SGM Ross as he leaped up to stand almost at attention. He smiled and said, "Sergeant Major, Jim, you need to loosen up. I know part of this is my fault. I called you by your rank. I meant it as an expression of respect, as I hope you know. We are off duty here, and in fact, since I am not on active duty right now, I am not a major per se. I would appreciate it if you would call me by my name. I'm Charlie. I would be grateful if I could call you by your given name also." Jim felt slightly uncomfortable. After all, for over 27 years he had called his superiors by their rank, and here was an O4, a major, wanting him to call him by his first name. He looked at Charlie and smiled. "I'll try, sir, but I don't know. You know how hard it is for us old soldiers to break that kind of habit." Charlie smiled and said, "Okay, Jim, come on. Let's get into my truck, and I'll show you about anywhere you might need to go or want to go while you're here." They drove several miles that afternoon, and Charlie showed Jim the best way to get to either of the larger towns in the area, Steelville and Prineville, as well as the way to a much smaller town only about 10 miles from the resort by road and about 5 miles by river. This town was called Wilson's Mill. Charlie explained that at one time there had really been a water-powered grist mill located there and ran by a man named Wilson, hence the name given to the settlement that had grown up around it. Wilson's Mill was what would now be called a bedroom community. There were no businesses or jobs in the community, and it was slowly withering away as older residents died and the younger ones moved away to find work. They stopped for a while in the little town of about 350 souls. The old mill building was still there, but had been closed for years. The old apparatus was still in the building. Charlie told Jim a couple had began refurbishing the mill about 10 years ago, but either lost interest or ran out of funds about 3 years ago. He had heard they had divorced shortly thereafter, so that might have even been the reason for halting the refurbishment. Charlie said, before they quit they had managed to get the mill wheels turning again. "I have heard some of the metal supports were not sound enough for normal operation, but I don't know for sure." The mill and 5 acres surrounding it was for sale. The mill pond dam was still in place but needed extensive repairs, as did the mill race. There were numerous large trees on the property, and the mill pond was full of steelhead trout because of the cool spring water that fed the stream there. The state stocked the stream every spring to keep the trout population up. Jim and Charlie sat on the bank of the mill pond and knocked back several beers from a cooler Charlie had brought from his truck. They talked for several minutes about many topics, but always came back to the army. Of course, like many soldiers, even part-time citizen soldiers as Charlie was, they played the "do you know so-and-so" game and told war stories. Of course, you know the difference between a fairy tale and a war story is generally the way the story begins. A fairy tale begins once upon a time, and a war story begins, no shit, this really happened. The two men were feeling no pain when they decided they needed to return to the resort. When they were getting into the truck, Jim looked over at Charlie and asked, "Charlie, are you sure you can drive this thing? We've both had way more to drink than we should. I wouldn't want us to do anything that would hurt someone else like Della." Charlie was sure he was over the legal limit of BAC from all the beer he had consumed, but he knew the back roads home and elected to drive anyway. Most of the roads he was going to use were so sparsely traveled you didn't see a vehicle on them. He said, "Jim, I'm probably legally drunk, but I am also sure I can do this safely. I promise to drive slowly and stay on the dirt roads all the way back to the resort. If I see a car coming, I will stop. I don't want an accident any more than you do." They then buckled themselves into the truck, and Charlie drove carefully off. As he promised, he drove on the smaller, dusty dirt roads back to the resort. He drove slowly, and they continued their conversation. When Charlie and Jim got back to Jim's cabin, they walked happily through it and onto the deck overlooking the river. On the way through the house, Charlie thoughtfully picked up the bottle of Glenlivet, some ice, and 2 glasses he saw sitting on the wet bar. The two men watched the sun slide down behind the trees to the west of the cabin as they talked and drank their scotch. About 6:30 p.m., one of the waitresses from the lodge brought some chips and sub sandwiches down for their supper. By then, Charlie and Jim were to the happy, laughing stage of their drinking. For some reason, they thought it was uproariously funny when she threatened to call Amanda and tell her Charlie was drunk as a skunk. After the waitress left to return to the lodge, Jim looked toward Charlie. Charlie was sitting staring across the river. Jim said, "You are very lucky to have Amanda. I can tell from last night and our talk today that you love her very much, and she loves you the same. Very few men can find a love as intense and fulfilling as I think you two have." Jim choked and his voice got rough as he continued. "I had a love like I see between you and Amanda, but some drunk little punk killed her. Sometimes I want nothing more than to get my hands on that little a-hole and make him hurt like he hurt my Della. The little shit was driving a brand new Mustang Shelby when he T-boned her. They estimated he was doing over 60 in a 25 zone when he ran a stop sign and hit her little Civic on the driver's door. He pushed her car almost 75 feet before they came to a stop. I had tried to talk her into driving the F-250 that day because she was planning on doing a lot of shopping. If she had, she might still be alive." Charlie looked over at Jim, and his voice, too, was rough and breaking. He said, "I know how you are hurting, Jim, but you have to let it go. It took me months to break out of the funk you're in, but you have to let it go and move on with your life." What the hell are you talking about, you a-hole? How the hell can you know how I feel?" how empty I feel and how it hurts every time I think about telling Della something. Charlie felt his temper rising, then forced himself to relax. He had thought Jim knew about Charlene, but maybe he didn't. Charlie began to talk. He said, "I don't know how you personally feel about the soldier that killed your wife, but I know all too well about the hole in your heart, in your soul from her loss. My first wife, Charlene, was an army aviator. She was commanding an aviation company in Afghanistan when she was shot down supporting an operation against the Taliban. She is buried in the family plot at the cemetery in Steelville. I spent many an evening trying to forget her and looking for my happiness at the bottom of a bottle like you were doing. I used to sit along the river bank with my booze and my sorrow, wishing I had the guts to just end it all, to make the hurt go away for good. One morning after I had slept in my chair beside the river all night, Mother came down to find me. She slapped me and gave me another one of her lectures. That time she said something that hit home. She asked me if I really thought Charlene would want me to sit and crawl into a bottle or die before my time. She asked if I really thought I was honoring her memory by turning into a drunken a-hole. I didn't quit drinking immediately, and it still took me a few weeks to get almost back to the way I was before Charlene died, but I clawed my way back. Each day was a little easier, but they were all hell on earth. I would catch myself wanting to tell Charlene something, and then realize I could never talk to her, or touch her, or smell her ever again. I cried, as I am sure you do, and I hurt, but I finally moved on. I sold my practice in Seattle and decided to move back here. It was almost a year after Charlene's death before I got all the loose ends tied up in Seattle. On my way home, I took my time and played the tourist. I met many wonderful people, many of whom are now very good friends of mine and who stop by here from time to time. Charlie smiled a little and continued. I met Amanda at the Testicle Festival in Rock Springs, Wyoming, and we spent several days together there. I traveled with her from there back to her family ranch in western Colorado, where I spent several more days getting to know her better. We started our first child while I was there. Of course, I didn't know that until after I got my head out of my butt and asked her to marry me several weeks later. Jim, trust me. It gets better even if it doesn't look like it will right now. Amanda and I have as much, no, even more love than I ever had with Charlene. It is a different kind of love, but she is my life now. Sometimes I am ashamed to admit how much I love and depend on her. She is my life, my lover, my reason for living, and I know there is no way I could get by without her. I don't mean to disrespect Charlene in any way. She is my first love, and there is still a small place in my heart set aside just for her, but Amanda is my life now. Even if you don't find another love as wonderful as I have, you will find something in the future to make your life wonderful and worth living again. Jim looked over at Charlie. He started to speak, then his eyes got large and he muttered, "Oh shit." Charlie turned toward where Jim was looking and saw Amanda standing there crying. She slowly moved toward Charlie, then sat on his lap. She bent and gave him a gentle kiss, then hugged him. She looked up at Jim and said, "Jim, he's right, you know. I didn't lose my first husband because he died. I divorced him because I caught him cheating on me, so I don't know how the two of you felt at the loss you experienced. Charlie is right about life getting better if you try to live it happily, though. I've heard him now twice talking about how much I mean to him when he didn't know I was around, and it just makes me love him more. I can't believe how lucky I am to have Charlie, and I don't begrudge Charlene that little piece of his heart he holds her memory in. You need to get your shit together, as you soldiers say, and move on. I never knew Della, but I know in my heart that she would want you to be happy again." Amanda smiled and stood. She held her hand out for Charlie and continued talking. "Now, honey, it's time for you to come home and go to sleep. Sarah called and told me I should come take you home because you were way too drunk to be driving." Amanda looked over at Jim and said, "We'll see you tomorrow, Jim. Why don't you come over to our place for supper?" Over the 2-week period, Jim did begin to heal. He relaxed and began to make friends with the residents of the Steelville area. He even went on some calls with Charlie and met some of the local farmers too. Several times he went to fish in the mill pond at Wilson's Mill. He felt more relaxed there than he did at the resort. Many of the young people of the town swam in the mill pond, and he spoke to some of the older townsfolk as well. Jim always had to take his own drinks and meal when he went to Wilson's Mill because there was nowhere in town to purchase those items. He had asked about that on his first visit and was surprised to find out the local convenience store and service station had burned a year before and never been rebuilt. Many of the residents were upset about that, but they said the old store owner had decided to retire on the money they got from insurance. They had said they barely made a living from sales and saw that as a good way out. Before the 2-week leave was up, Jim Ross contacted the real estate agent about the mill. They toured the building and discussed improvements and the price of the property. Jim liked the area and the property. He had friends in the Fieldings and felt like he was making friends in Wilson's Mill and the surrounding area. Jim decided to make an offer on the property contingent on his home outside Fort Riley selling. The mill owners were asking $149,990 for the mill and surrounding land. Jim offered $125,000 and ended up purchasing the place for $137,000. When he returned to duty, Jim was on the mend, but he felt out of place. For some reason, he felt uncomfortable now in his office, almost as if he were an outsider now. At the end of his second week, he made a decision that would change his life forever. Jim decided that the military part of his life was over. He missed the Wilson's Mill area and the slower, more relaxed life he could have there. Jim went to the Personnel Services office and put in for his retirement effective at the earliest possible time. He was informed it would be at least 2 months before everything was approved, and possibly 3. Jim left that office feeling better than he had in months. When he returned to his office, he walked straight to the general's office and knocked on his door. When the general looked up, he asked, "General, do you have a moment, please, sir?" General frowned slightly and motioned his sergeant major into his office. After the formalities, he asked SGM Ross to have a seat. Jim leaned back in his chair and licked his lips. He said, "General, I want to thank you again for making me take that leave. It was what I needed in Major Fielding. Hell, all the Fieldings were what I needed to get my head screwed on straight. I think it really helped to talk to Major Fielding about how he felt when his wife was shot down." Jim looked up and saw the question in the general's eyes. He knew the general was busy and could tell he wanted him to get on with his business. He took a deep breath and said, "General, I'm sorry for taking up your time, but I wanted to tell you, sir, that I have realized the last 2 weeks since I returned from that leave that I don't belong here any longer. I think this phase of my life is over, sir, and I applied for my retirement this morning." The general's face showed his surprise. He leaned back in his chair and stared at his sergeant major in shock. Finally, he said, "Jim, are you sure that is the best thing for you? I don't know what I would do, what the division would do without you. Hell, the Army has been your life now for what, 26 years? No, sir. I've been in almost 27 years, but I think it's time to move on. I found a nice little town near Steelville that I like, and I like the people there. I was able to begin to forget the pain there, and here everything I see and do reminds me of Della. I see a young soldier and I remember that little a-hole that killed her. I am still having trouble dealing with my feelings, and I am not as productive as I was, as I need to be. You and the division deserve, you need, more than I have to give now. Sir, it's time to go. I'm sure of that. Well, I have to admit I'm very surprised and somewhat disappointed, but I understand. We all have to face the fact that sometime in our career it is, or it will be time to hang it up. I'll miss you, but I'll do my best to help you move on with your life. Thank you, General." The next 2.5 months went by. Some days, some weeks, went slowly. Some flew by depending on Jim's emotional health, his anticipation of his retirement, and, of course, upon his workload. He was impressed with his replacement and knew he had made the right decision. His replacement was as efficient as Jim had ever been and seemed to be very knowledgeable. Finally, the day of his retirement came. Jim's 2 children and their families were in a place of honor on the reviewing stand with him. After the speeches were made and the troops marched past, Jim closed the door on that part of his life. His house had sold several weeks before his retirement. Jim had made arrangements to close on his new property the Monday after his retirement. In a way, Jim was sorry to leave the Army, but for the most part, he was now eagerly awaiting his new life. He had been back to Wilson's Mill a couple of times and had plans for reworking the old mill. He was going to turn one end of the building into living quarters for himself and had decided he wanted to make the mill fully operational once more too. Jim spent the rest of Thursday, July 3rd, and the holiday weekend with his family near Fort Riley, Kansas, his last duty post. Early on the first Sunday after his retirement, Jim and his children had breakfast together, then they all departed, promising to get together once again soon. His children returned to their homes and jobs, and Jim drove to his new home and the old mill at Wilson's Millimo. He still missed his Della deeply, but he was looking forward to his new life also. Something about his new town resonated deeply within him. Jim pulled into the mill parking lot late that evening and camped under the trees near the mill pond. The next morning, Jim was sitting in a lawn chair, enjoying the coffee he had made on his camp stove. He had rose at his normal time and was watching as the sun began peeking through the trees to the east of his property. He was watching the world come alive and enjoying both the morning and his coffee when his solitude was rudely interrupted by 2 cars speeding into the dusty gravel parking lot. They slid to a stop nearby, and 4 large teenage boys tumbled from them. They grabbed fishing equipment and headed for the pond. 2 of the boys detoured from the most direct route and walked arrogantly up to Jim. The larger of the 2 sneered at Jim and said, "Hey, old man, this is private property. You need to get your butt back into that truck and get out of here." Jim felt his temper surge. He clamped down on his immediate angry response and carefully sat his coffee cup down. Jim stood and faced the two boys. He carefully looked them up and down, then used the voice that had sent many young soldiers quaking when he felt the need to correct their behavior in his prior life. Jim said, "Son, I know this is private property, and I don't appreciate either your attitude or your arrogant demands that I leave. I was going to allow you and your friends to fish this morning, but now I think you all just need to leave before things happen that would be painful for everyone concerned. Old man, you got this all wrong. This is our private fishing hole, and we don't allow anyone else to use it. If you don't want to get hurt, you better get your butt gone right now." The tall boy set his fishing gear down and moved toward Jim as he said that. Jim set his feet and said, "I'm telling you for the last time, son, you need to get off my land right now. I bought this property and I don't need young hot-headed boys around causing trouble. Now get." The other two boys had come up from the pond when they saw their friends and Jim arguing. They were moving to surround him when yet another vehicle pulled into the parking lot. A young law enforcement officer got out of the unmarked car and moved up to the tents group. He looked at Jim surrounded by the four boys and asked, "Okay, Pete, what's going on here this morning?" "This a-hole has been camping here at our fishing hole, and we told him he needed to leave because it was private property. We were just making sure he moved on, Sam." The patrolman looked over at Jim, then back to Pete before he said, "Pete, I wasn't aware you had purchased the old mill. What gives you the right to ask this gentleman to move on?" "Hell, Sam, you know Pa's been hired to take care of the place. I was just rousting him out so's he didn't break nothing or steal it. This been our spot ever since that rich bitch and her husband left and asked Pa to take care of it for them. He don't belong here, and if you're set on bothering someone, you need to take after him. He's the one that don't belong here." The patrolman turned to Jim and asked for some ID. Jim reached into his pocket and handed him his retired military ID card. After he looked it over, it was handed back to Jim, and the patrolman said, "Okay, Sergeant Major. Pete is correct, even though I am pretty sure he wasn't the most polite individual while imparting his information. This is private property and no camping is allowed." He turned to Pete and continued, "Pete, I think you and your friends need to leave also. I'll handle this from here." With black looks and subdued mutterings, the four boys angrily returned to their vehicles and left in another cloud of dust. Sam turned back to Jim and began talking once more. He said, "I'm sorry for having to run you off, but the owners don't allow anyone to camp or use this area. They even told me they don't want Pete and his friends here except to help Pete's father keep the place up. I can see you aren't damaging anything, but the place is posted against trespassing, and I will have to ask you to leave." He smiled and continued, "I have to go make my rounds now though, so I don't suppose I would notice if you just happened to finish your coffee and maybe breakfast before you packed back up and left." Jim smiled at Sam and said, "Well, Sam, I appreciate that, but I don't think I'll be leaving." Before he could continue, he saw the dark look come over Sam's face and held up his hand. He rapidly continued talking, "I'm sorry, Sam. I didn't mean it like that. I should have told you first that I just bought the old mill and I'm going to be living here now. I will sign the final papers later today. I just retired from the army and am moving back here to find some peace and quiet. I was visiting with the Fieldings this spring and they showed me this place and it felt so much like home I decided to move back here and make it my home." Sam relaxed and a big grin split his face. He said, "Oh, good. I'm sorry I took you wrong, but, well, you know how it is, I'm sure. You may have some trouble with Pete and his crew though. They try to run roughshod over folks hereabouts. He was quarterback of the football team and thinks he's the best thing to hit this town in forever. One of these days he's going to get into some real trouble if something doesn't happen. Well, anyway, I have to get on with my rounds. Congratulations on your new home, and I guess I'll be seeing you around now." "Sure, Sam. Hell, drop by for some coffee anytime if you want." After the paperwork on the property was completed, Jim unloaded his truck into the old mill. Over the next few days, he cleaned out the debris in and around the mill and made a list of material he would need to begin the refurbishing. Before he started working on the structure, he wanted to know if it was sound and what he needed to do to reinforce it if it was not. Jim was lucky in several ways. There was no county or village zoning, so he didn't need permits to remodel. He also made use of contacts he made in the service and called in some favors to get a couple of friends who were engineers to come inspect the building. They wrote up their impression informally, and he was relieved. The building was structurally sound and mostly needed cosmetic repairs. Of course, since it had been a mill for its entire life, it needed major renovation before Jim could live within. His mill did need modern wiring and heating, but that was a given. They did point out where the structural supports for the mill wheel and grinding wheels needed repair, but that, too, was minor. Jim also opted to build on a 3-car garage at one end of the structure. One of the bays he would make into a small workshop, another would be used for his small lawn tractor. Jim decided his first jobs would be to replace all the windows and doors, then get his new living quarters built. The mill had been a large one with a large open area for storing and selling grain, feed, and meal. At one time it had been a feed mill, as well as a grist mill, so had quite a lot of room to convert. As much as he hated the thought of getting the interior wet, Jim decided to power wash the dust out of the area he was converting to living quarters. Since it was summer, he thought it would dry fine by the time new windows were installed and the interior partitions were up. Jim decided to make a large living area downstairs to include a master suite and large kitchen dining area. There would be a small office and larger living room also. Upstairs, he would eventually make another 2 bedrooms, small sitting area, and bath for when his children visited. In the area over the milling area, he would build storage and still leave a small warehouse area for unground grain. Downstairs in front of the grinding wheel area, there was approximately 30 by 60 feet of office space and display area where inventory had been displayed in the past. Jim was surprisingly happy as he began his work. Jim decided to continue his exercise regimen from the army, albeit at a less intense rate. He would run at least 3 times a week and did some other exercises on other days. After his exercise, he would sit and have his coffee each morning alongside the mill pond. He would have a light breakfast, then work until he got hungry, eat, rest a while, and work more during the afternoon. Many afternoons he would cook and eat beside the mill pond. The previous owners had installed a covered patio or picnic area there with a gas grill. He liked to sit there and relax as he watched the sun set behind the trees to the west. From time to time, Sam would drop by for coffee in the morning or just to visit during the day or evening. As time progressed, some of the townsfolk would also drop by to see what Jim was doing. He was impressed with how friendly everyone was. He knew some of these small towns were sort of cliquish, but this one didn't seem to be so bad. Of course, people became even friendlier when they began to notice that some of the Fieldings and Stevens would drop by to visit Jim from time to time. Jim did the interior conversion right. He had solid oak paneling on the walls, triple pane windows installed, granite countertops, and stainless appliances. The carpets were thick and well padded, and there was a floating pergo floor installed in the kitchen, ceramic tile in the large bathroom. In short, his living quarters were quite luxurious. He had finished the downstairs living area by the end of September and had begun working on the millworks and milling area. From time to time, some of the younger and not so young local residents would come to see if they could fish in the mill pond. Well, that wasn't quite correct either. Jim owned up to the water line, and they would ask if they could park on and fish from his property. He also had easements and permissions from the Corps of Engineers to maintain and control the mill dam and water flume for his water wheel. He could not stop people from using boats or wading in the water. After he had been in town a couple of weeks, Jim had met enough people he was beginning to be well known. While he was running around town, they would wave and speak. When he was in the army, he ran 4 to 6 miles a day, 3 to 5 days a week, as well as did calisthenics. Jim decided he would continue running but shorter distances. He thought he would purchase some weight machines to put in the mill after he finished the renovations, but for now he would just run and do his exercises. Jim continued to have trouble with Pete and his friends, and they exchanged words more than once. One afternoon, Jim saw Pete and his friends roughing up a young boy while a younger girl watched crying. She saw him standing by the mill and ran to him. She cried, "Please help. Pete's going to hurt Calvin. We didn't do anything to them, and they're going to hit him." Jim had already decided to stop things before she came up. He was starting for the boys when he saw Pete's friends hold the boy's arms, and Pete began to hit him in the stomach and face. Jim told the girl to go into his house and call Sam, then he ran for the 3 older boys and Calvin. Jim grabbed Pete and pulled him away from Calvin. "Damn it, Pete, stop that. I want you off this property now, and I don't ever want to see you here again. Do I make myself clear?" Pete stumbled away from Calvin. After he got his balance, he turned to Jim and snarled, "You a hole? I've had it with you. Now I'm going to teach you a lesson. We'll come onto this property anytime we want to, old man, and we'll do anything we want to while we're here. I'm tired of your shit." Pete threw a punch at Jim, but it never landed. Jim dodged the punch and launched himself at Pete. Pete never landed a blow. Jim took him down and left him lying in the dust before he turned to the 2 boys holding Calvin. They threw Calvin from them and into the mill pond before advancing on Jim. Even 2-on-1, it was no match. One of the boys did get a hold on Jim's arm, but he broke the hold, twisted the boy's arm, and dislocated it. It hurt so much the young man just sat cradling it while he watched his buddy advance on Jim. Jim heard Sam drive into his lot and saw the billowing dust out of the corner of his eye as the 3rd boy approached. Jim saw the boy had a stick in his hand and was trying to brain him with it. He smiled to himself. It was so obvious the boy had no combat training. He was holding the stick over his head to bring it down onto Jim. Jim watched and waited. Then when the arm came down, he grabbed it, twisted, and began to dislocate it when he heard movement behind him. He twisted, still pulling the boy with him, and threw him toward and into Pete. The boy Jim had thrown screamed and crumpled, falling on top of Pete. By them Sam had ran up and was holding his gun on Pete. Jim stood and looked around, then down at the boy he had thrown into Pete. He was lying in a pool of blood and holding his side where a knife was sticking from his body. Sam was talking into his microphone as Jim looked on. Jim saw Calvin floundering in the mill pond, trying to climb out. He ran to the pond and pulled him from it, only to see him grabbed and hugged by the young girl. He said, "You two kids go over there and sit down a minute. I'm sure Sam will want to talk to you before we get you home." Jim returned to Sam and helped him cuff Pete then. After Sam cuffed the man with the dislocated arm, he helped with the injured young man. They had just done all the bandaging they could when first a sheriff's deputy, then a highway patrol car drove into the lot. Shortly thereafter, an ambulance arrived. By this time, many of the nearby neighbors had began to drift over to see what the excitement was about. Needless to say, Jim didn't get any more work done that day. As the officers were taking statements, a very pretty woman in her mid to late 30s arrived and ran to Calvin and the young girl. Jim could see the tears running down her cheeks as she hugged the children. After all the statements were taken, the woman came up to Jim and said, "Thank you, sir. You saved my son's life, or at least saved him from a worse beating than he received. He's a good boy and was trying to protect his sister from that animal. Pete has been trying to, well, he's been after Sarah to go out with him. She's only 14 and I don't want her dating yet, especially with a 19-year-old boy. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Cheryl Dotson and these are my children." Cheryl smiled slightly and pushed her children toward the road in town before she continued speaking. She said, "I need to get the kids home now, but, well, thank you again. If I can ever help you, just call. I don't know how else I can thank you. I owe you so much, but I don't have much money since their father died." Jim smiled at the young mother and said, "You don't owe me anything, Cheryl. I just did what needed to be done. Hell, anyone would have helped if they'd been here." Cheryl jerked her head back toward Jim and stared at him, then she said heatedly, No, they wouldn't have. Pete and his friends have most of the people in town buffaloed, and I'm pretty sure no one would have stepped in like you did. There have been a couple who crossed swords with Pete, and they've been hurt pretty badly in accidents. No one can prove Pete had anything to do with it, but they both blamed him for what happened. He pushes and bullies all the younger people in town, and some of the older ones. I'm really scared when he gets back out of jail." Jim continued to run on the roads around town. After they got over the surprise of seeing a grown man running down the street, many of the townsfolk would wave and call a greeting when Jim ran by. On one of his runs, he found where Calvin and his sister lived. He saw the little girl in the front window, and Calvin was sitting on the front porch petting a mid-sized dog. They waved as Jim passed. From then on, when he ran past their house, he looked for the children and made a point of waving to them or speaking if they were close enough. They seemed like good kids. He was beginning to wonder what their and their mother's story was. Over the weeks after the little altercation, Jim was a small-town celebrity, but then things returned mostly to normal. People would now stop him from time to time to visit with him, and he was becoming a recognized member of the community. Throughout the days following his altercation with Pete and his friends, the renovations to the millworks went on well. Jim climbed around, cleaned parts, greased parts, tightened bolts, and reinforced the machinery as needed. He had to hire a little help with some welding and breaking loose some of the larger bolts, but all in all, he did the work himself. He made plans to do a test run of the grinding wheel on the third Saturday of October. During his visits with his neighbors, Jim had told a few of the people, including Sam, who had stopped by to visit while he was finishing up the work, when he planned to test the mechanism in the mill. Jim bought several bushels of corn and wheat from the Stevens farm to use as a test. He had read all he could on the internet about operating the old mill, and had even taken a 2-day trip to visit an old grist mill that was still in operation. When the operators found out he was restoring Wilson's mill, they gave him some instruction and demonstrated what he needed to do. The morning he was to actually operate the mill for the first time, he was surprised to find a large crowd gathering to watch. There was a festive atmosphere, and many of the townsfolk had brought coolers and yard chairs. Almost everyone politely asked if they could stay and watch. Jim was surprised, but gracefully allowed them to stay with the understanding they stayed out of the area where the mill machinery was. Traffic and attendance got so heavy that Sam actually called for a deputy sheriff to help with controlling the crowd. Finally, Jim decided everything was ready for his test. He loaded wheat into the hopper on the second floor, then returned to the first floor to begin grinding. He moved to the levers and controls. He engaged the water wheel, then opened the water gates to allow water to race down the flume and begin turning the water wheel. Slowly, the weight of the water caused the wheel to turn. As it began turning, there was a groan, Then a grinding sound and the great stone grinding wheels began moving. When they were at speed, Jim opened the chute and allowed the wheat to begin flowing down to the grinding wheels. Those who could see let out a cheer when the wheels started turning. Then, once again, they cheered when the first flour poured down the exit chute and fell into a collection container. After Jim ground 2 bushels of wheat, he stopped the mill, reset the equipment, loaded corn into the hopper, and then restarted the machinery to grind some cornmeal. Once again, the crowd cheered as they watched the freshly ground cornmeal flow into its collection container. After the 2 bushels of corn were ground, Jim closed the flume, waited for the mill to stop turning, then unhitched the water wheel from the grinding machinery so it could not start up accidentally. He walked outside onto the covered porch to see the crowd. When he exited the building, they let out a roar and surged toward him. Jim walked down onto the gravel lot and accepted the congratulations and handshakes of his neighbors, many of whom had already become his friends. It was almost 4 p.m. before the last person left and Jim could relax. He was so pumped he didn't know what to do, and his face almost hurt from the constant smile he had all day. One of the last persons who had been there had been an older man, and he invited Jim to go to the Steelville Senior Center for supper and the weekly senior center dance. He said, "Jim, we all have been talking and seeing as how you're new and don't have a wife." "Aw shit. Jim, I'm sorry. I know you lost your wife a while back. What I meant to say was that there's a lot more single women around here than men, and we all would like to have you come over and eat and visit with us." Jim hadn't promised one way or another, but the more he thought about it, the more he wanted to go. Mostly he wanted to meet more of the people who lived around his new home, but he also didn't feel like cooking that night, and the thought of eating there won him over. When Jim walked into the room at the senior center, he stopped to look around. He noticed the rapid lessening of the noise as everyone saw a new face enter. Jim immediately felt out of place. He was obviously the youngest person there at 45. Most of the other people looked like they were in their late 50s or older. Jim was looking for some place to sit when he saw a familiar face. Jim and Fielding were at a table to the side of the room. He walked up to say hello, then he planned to find another seat. He was still operating on the old, active-duty military social rules. You made your manners to the brass, then found another table to sit at as was proper. As he approached the table, Jim Fielding stood and smiled. He reached his hand out to shake, and they stood visiting for a moment. Jim began to make his excuses to leave when Jim Fielding looked surprised and said, "Whoa there, Haas. Where the heck do you think you're off to? And then I have a couple of empty chairs here. Unless you have someone else waiting on you, why don't you just sit with us?" Jim stood a moment, then said, "Yes, sir." He then moved toward one of the free chairs. After SGM Ross took his seat, Jim Fielding sat and leaned on the table. He looked over at Jim and pursed his lips. Finally, he said, "Jim, I don't want to embarrass you, but I think we need to clear the air here. I know what you were trying to do there when you were going to leave. That would have been the proper thing to do if we were still on active duty. We're both retired now, and I would like to think we're friends. I'm not a colonel any longer, and you're not a sergeant major. Oh, I know we would carry those ranks if we were both called back onto active duty. If we were recalled, we would have to observe the proprieties, but here and now we're both Jim, and this is Ann. I know the boys don't expect you to call them by their rank or to defer to them, and I don't either. We all live and work together in the community and are just home folks now. Now, if you really don't want to eat with us, that's one thing, but if you were worried about rank, just drop it. We're both old soldiers. We're neighbors more or less, and I would appreciate it if we could just hang together here." Jim smiled and said, "Sure, Colonel, Jim. I knew that things were more relaxed after you retired. I just wasn't thinking on several levels. I just assumed you had someone coming to join you, and I just fell back on old habits. I would be pleased to share your table, sir. Jim, around here, whether we are in the cafe, the senior center, or wherever, we just sit in an empty chair if we want to visit with or eat with whoever is already at the table. If they have someone coming to join them, they let you know, or their guest pulls up another table or chair if need be. After the meal, served buffet style, each person took their plates back to the scullery. A small band walked onto the stage where their instruments were already set up and began to play. Slowly, the dance floor filled with couples. Jim sat and watched as Jim and Fielding danced. When they returned to the table and smiled at Jim and held out her hand, she pulled him to his feet and let him lead her to the dance floor. Jim didn't even get to sit down when he took him back to the table. A short, plump, blue-haired woman walked up to Jim and took his hand. She tugged him toward the dance floor, and as he followed, she looked over her shoulder and said, "Hi, I'm Doris. I've seen you at the cafe over here in town a time or two, haven't I?" Joe said he'd invited a new man to come tonight. "I wanted to get my claws into you first, but I see and beat me. A bunch of us here like to dance, and these old men get tired out too easily. I hope you can keep it up longer than some of them." She gave Jim a wicked grin when she said that. Doris pulled Jim up near the stage, and turned, moving into his arms. As the dance progressed, she moved closer and closer to him until she was rubbing her abdomen against him. When that dance ended, Jim started to return to his seat, and another woman grabbed him and pulled him onto the dance floor. He had to dance 3 more dances before the band took a break, and he staggered back to his chair. Jim Fielding and Ann were smiling at him when he returned. He collapsed into his chair and took a large drink from his glass. He leaned back and Jim broke out into a big guffaw. Ann's smile just got larger. Jim Fielding leaned toward Jim and said, "I don't want to be lecturing an old soldier like you, Jim, but a word to the wise might be in order. Some of the unattached and even a few of the attached ones call this the meat market. A lot of these ladies are piranhas. They latch onto any man they can, especially a new visitor to the dances, and won't let him go. From time to time, the women here almost come to blows over a particularly good catch in a man. If you're looking to sleep around and don't mind an older woman, this is the place to find one. Take Doris, for example. She was the first one you danced with, in case you forgot. I wouldn't be surprised if she didn't try to get you to go home with her, or to come home with you." Jim Fielding blushed and gave a sick smile. He looked over at Ann and she nodded her head yes. He continued talking, "Doris, there has even been known to take a man outside in the parking lot and have relations with him. Back when I was divorced, I came to a couple of these dances and made the mistake of going home with her. We had sex and I figured out within a couple of weeks that had been a serious error. She showed up at my home one day wanting to move in some of her clothes. We had quite a row when I refused to let her. Additionally, she isn't too particular who she has sex with and never requires protection. She has been known to pass on a disease or two. So a word to the wise, my friend. A word to the wise." Jim felt himself becoming more and more shocked as Jim Fielding talked. Hell, the women here acted like the bitches in some of the bars outside military posts. They were just older. He leaned back in his chair and stared across the table at the couple. Finally, he found his voice and said, "Damn, I never would have believed, man, that's a lot to think about. They don't care that I would be several years younger than they are? I mean, I can see I am probably the youngest man, hell, the youngest person in here by several years. Hoo-hoo." He was still sitting in shock when Doris trotted up to his side again. She smiled and reached for his hand to pull him back onto the dance floor. Jim looked up at her and resisted her attempts. She frowned and said, "What's the matter, honey? Come on. I want to dance more now." Jim looked over at the Fieldings and pulled back on Doris. As she stepped toward him, he said, "Doris, I'm pretty tired right now. I worked all day and just need to sit and relax a little. Would you just sit here with me a moment, please?" Doris frowned and looked at the Fieldings, then she sat beside Jim. Jim Fielding turned to Ann and held out his hand. "Honey, would you like one more dance before we leave?" And smiled and rose to follow her husband onto the dance floor. After the Fieldings had left, Jim turned to Doris. They visited about the town and his mill for a few moments, then he said, "Thanks for the dance, Doris, and for wanting to dance more, but I think I need to clear the air with you and some of the other ladies here. I lost my wife less than a year ago, and I'm still not comfortable thinking of other women. I enjoyed our dances, and if I ever come back here, I would be pleased to dance with you again. I am not ready for a relationship, though, and I don't want you or any of the other ladies to think I am leading them on. I plan to limit myself to one dance an evening with any one lady, so nothing can be assumed about my intentions." Doris sat and looked at him a moment, then said, "Well, you sanctimonious prick. I heard you was a retired army man, hell. One of my husbands was in the army, and I know how you all are. You'd screw anything you could talk into holding still long enough to get your meat into it. What's the matter? You too good for all us old women? Or did that creep Jim Fielding fill your head full of his crap about me?" Doris jumped from her chair and turned to walk off. As she was leaving, she said vehemently, "Well, you can just go to hell, Mr. High and Mighty. You'll come crawling back here one of these days and beg us to go with you when you find out there's no young stuff like you're used to." Jim and in returned as Doris was flouncing off. They sat down once more and Jim said, "Well, old friend, sounds like you got about the same speech I got when I told her I didn't want to date her either. She is right about one thing, though. There aren't many women your age around here. When you get ready to look again, though, you will have a couple to choose from, or you can go to one of the larger towns. We mostly have very young divorcees or older widows like you see here." About midnight, Jim decided to return to his home and go to bed. When Jim arrived at his truck, he started to walk between it and the car parked next to it. He noticed the car was rocking, and he heard moaning coming from within. Jim looked into the back seat and saw Doris under one of the men she had been dancing with earlier. Jim stood and watched in surprise as she hit her peak. She strained against her lover and screamed. Jim smiled to himself and thought, "Yep, just like the bitches in the bars around military bases. Sure, glad Jim warned me about her." Jim continued his journey between the vehicles. entered his truck and drove off, heading for home and his soft, warm, but lonely bed. He slept late the next morning and decided to take the day off. Around dusk, Jim took his fishing line and decided to see if he could catch some trout from around his mill wheel. He was deeply engrossed in his endeavor when he once again heard young voices nearby. As the voices began to rise, he could tell they were taunting someone. Jim crawled from the machinery supports and walked around the corner to see Pete's two uninjured friends taunting Calvin once again. Jim yelled at them and told them to get off his property. After they had left, Calvin walked up to Jim and thanked him once again for helping him. He stood looking at Jim for a minute, then in a trembling voice he asked, "Sir, I've been seeing you run around town and I see you here doing exercises some days too. I heard you used to be a soldier and I was wondering, could you maybe help me? I'm tired of those guys picking on me and Sarah, and I thought maybe you could show me how you kept them from hurting you the other day." Jim stood looking at the earnest expression on the boy's face. He was a well-developed lad, but he looked soft. Finally, he asked, "Why me, son? Why don't you ask your father to help you with that?" "I can't do that, sir. My daddy died from cancer a couple years ago, and now it's only mother and Sarah and me. I could pay if you didn't want too much if that's the problem." "No, son, I don't need or want your money. Tell you what, you get your mother to come down here so we can talk about it, and if she says it's okay, maybe I'll help you a little. I would expect you to work hard and do everything I said, though. I wouldn't take any excuses, and there might be times you would hate me before we got done. Now why don't you go home and think about this? Talk it over with your mother, then if you still want to do that, you all need to come down here and we'll see what happens." "Yes, sir." Calvin smiled and took off running for home. Jim didn't see or hear from him the rest of the week. He didn't even see him around his house the 2 times he ran past it. In fact, by Saturday evening, he had completely forgotten his talk with Calvin. He had continued to work on his place and was thinking almost exclusively about it. Jim was on his patio looking over the stream when he heard a car drive up and voices coming from the front of his home. He heard the doorbell and walked around the side of the house to see Calvin, Sarah, and their mother looking in the front window for him. "Can I help you?" he asked. "Oh," Cheryl said as she turned toward Jim. "I'm sorry to bother you, but Calvin said you wanted to talk to me about something. I'm sorry I am so late tonight, but today, this evening, is the first time I have had free to see you. Is there some problem or something I can help you with, Mr. Ross?" Jim looked at Calvin and he was blushing. He refused to look Jim in the eye. Jim said, "Well, I don't know how to answer that question, Mrs. Dotson. What has Calvin told you I said? Maybe we should start from there?" "Why, nothing. He just said you wanted to talk to me about his trouble with Pete." Cheryl turned to look at Calvin and continued, "Calvin, what's going on here? I thought you said Mr. Ross wanted to see me." "He does, Mom. I asked him if he would teach me how to fight, and he said he wouldn't unless you and he talked and you told him it was okay. I know how you feel about fighting, but, Mom, I need to know something about it. What if he hadn't been here to help me that time? Those guys might have really hurt Sarah, and I need to be able to help her." Cheryl turned to look at Jim and she said, "Mr. Ross, I'm sorry we bothered you. I thought you wanted to see me about something important. We'll go now, and I'm sorry we bothered you this evening." Cheryl and 2 dejected children turned to walk back to their car. Calvin gave Jim a hurt look over his shoulder as they turned. Jim didn't even know he had spoken until he heard the words coming from his mouth. He said, "Wait, Mrs. Dotson. I think I'm almost as upset with Calvin as you must be, but he does have a point. Would you and the children like to sit on my patio with me for a few minutes while we see what we can do about this?" Cheryl said, "Thank you, but no, I don't think that's a good idea. But Mom, think about it. You know Dad was getting ready to teach me to box before he..." Cheryl and the children had several minutes of conversation, then she turned to Jim and said, "Well, I suppose I can stay and visit a few minutes." She looked at Calvin and continued, "But you haven't heard the last of this young man." Jim and the Dotson family visited for almost an hour and a half before they came to an understanding. Cheryl agreed to let Jim teach Calvin some basic self-defense moves, but insisted he not be taught anything more. She had agreed that he needed to be in better physical condition, so agreed he could run and exercise with Jim occasionally too. Jim refused to take any pay for his help, but did say he would let Calvin do odd jobs for him occasionally as recompense. They outlined a schedule for the first month, and all understood if Calvin did not adhere to the schedule, Jim would stop helping him. Jim made it a habit to run from his home to Calvin's, where they met to begin Calvin's run. Jim did most of his run before getting to Calvin's home, so he could exercise with him after they ran together. Calvin was supposed to do his stretches and warm-ups before Jim arrived, so they could go immediately to the run. Calvin ran with Jim until he could go no farther than they turned around and ran back to his house at the best pace they could make. Jim didn't like the fact he had to run slower than he normally would when Calvin was with him, but that was what it took. After arriving back at Calvin's home, they walked a short distance to cool down, then did their stretching exercises once more before doing their exercises. After they had been running together for 2 weeks, Jim noticed Calvin running faster. In fact, coming at the end of his run like it did, there were days when Jim was pushing to keep up with Calvin. They began to run a circular route instead of out and back. During cool down in the middle of the 3rd week of running, Jim said, "Calvin, you're picking up the pace and running much better than I expected. I'm surprised you are doing so well. I keep increasing the distance and you stick right with me. How much time do you have for our exercises? Do I need to stop increasing your distance, or how do we handle that?" Calvin smiled and replied, "Mom says I can have all the time I need as long as I get all my chores done. We will either have to start earlier or cut down pretty quickly though, because I am running close on getting ready for school now. I guess I could run alone in the evenings, and we could just do the exercises in the mornings if you wanted to. I'm glad I'm picking up the running this fast. I guess I hadn't lost as much wind and muscle as we thought." "What do you mean, Calvin?" "Oh, I used to run cross-country but stopped when Dad died. It's only been a little over a year, so I guess I kept some of my capability. I never did much exercise though, and the push-ups, sit-ups and so forth are still hurting quite a lot. Wish I could do more of the exercises, but I guess that will come with time and practice." Jim and Calvin decided they would just exercise in the mornings together, and Calvin would run evenings alone. He was going to try for the cross-country team again at school, and that would take care of the running when the team started practicing. They would run together weekends, but that was all. Many times when Jim and Calvin were exercising at Jim's home, Calvin's sister Sarah would come with him. Jim had no problem with that, and soon found he was helping her exercise and use his weight machines also. For some reason, he felt good about helping the children and missed them the few days they didn't come over. In early December, Jim and Calvin had made their run and were back at Calvin's home doing their stretches and cool down when Pete and his 3 friends drove up. They jumped out of the car and the 4 boys surrounded Jim and Calvin. They began pushing and were trying to catch and hold the 2 friends. Jim was able to resist the 2 who were after him and was getting in some good punches, but Calvin was held by the 3rd boy. Pete walked up to Jim and snarled, "Damn you, you old pig. I owned this town until you showed up, and I'm going to own it again. We have our court date next week, and I'm tired of screwing with you. You need to go do whatever you have to, old man, because I want those charges dismissed. If this shit keeps up, someone's going to get hurt. Understand me? How would you like it if little Callie boy here, or maybe Sarah, had an accident? You get us off, old man, or that is sure going to happen." By this time, the 2 boys had managed to grab Jim's arms and were holding him. Pete walked up in front of him and hit Jim in the stomach with his fist. Jim managed to clench his muscles enough to absorb some of the blow. He folded partly over and Pete stepped back grinning. "That hurt, old man? Well, you better get used to it, because we're going to give you a little taste this morning, so you know what's waiting on you in these damn Dotsons if you don't make things right for us." Pete stepped toward Jim once more, and Jim acted. He lunged back and bent at the waist, slightly kicking his right foot upward. His foot connected with Pete's chin, and Pete's head slammed back. Pete fell like a pole-axed steer, and Jim's momentum caused the boys holding him to fall backward. As they fell, they lost hold on Jim. As they were falling, they heard the sound of sirens drawing up beside the yard. The 2 boys on the street were rising when the one holding Calvin let him go and said, "Quick guys, get up and let's get out of here." They turned to Pete, and he was still lying where he had fallen. Jim looked toward the siren and saw Sam getting out of the city patrol car.